Tonight, we begin with the grim, bizarre, and often perilous existence of a man whose sole purpose was to make others laugh, the medieval court jester. The floppy hat, the jingling bells, the razor-sharp wit, it all seems like merry entertainment until you realize one wrong joke could land you in a dungeon. So before you settle in, hit that like button and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy this content, and drop a comment about where you're watching from and the time there. It's always fascinating to see our global audience. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some white noise, and let's dive into tonight's tale. So, you think you'd like to be a court jester? Tough luck. No one aspired to be one. It wasn't a career you trained for. It was a fate that befell you, like catching the plague or being born left-handed in a sword-wielding world. Most jesters didn't grow up dreaming of juggling turnips for moody nobles. They were chosen, not for their resume, but for some quirk, a limp, a hunchback, a squeaky voice, or maybe just being unervingly clever or bizarrely short. Someone in power would point and declare, "That one, he's amusing. Let's keep him. Congrats, your personality just got drafted." Sometimes it started with a single accidental joke. Maybe you slipped in mud at a feast and made a noble snort into his wine, or you mocked a rival baron just loud enough to be overheard. The next morning, you're not back in your peasant hovel. You're in the castle, handed a bell-covered hat and a lifelong job description. Be entertaining. Forever. Other times, you were bought. Yes, purchased. Lords collected jesters like exotic pets or oversized goblets. If you were particularly witty or odd-looking, you might be gifted between courts like a sarcastic party favor. You didn't apply for this role. You were selected the way a chicken is chosen for stew suddenly and without consent. From that moment, your life wasn't yours. You were the court's laugh dispenser, trotted out at feasts, summoned during tense political meetings, paraded like a mascot for visiting diplomats. Refusal wasn't an option. Walk away, and you'd be back to plowing fields, or worse, mistaken for a vagrant and tossed in the stocks. In medieval society, a man without land, title, or purpose was begging to be punished for merely existing. So yes, in theory, you were an entertainer. In reality, a high-stress, low-pay, full-time joke machine on retainer for people who could have you whipped for bad timing. And that was just the audition. You might not perform under spotlights, but make no mistake, in court, you were always on. Being a jester wasn't a 9 to 5 gig. It was your identity. You ate, slept, and breathed among nobles, yet you'd never be one of them. You were their amusement, their curiosity, their living what-if scenario, the court's emotional support oddball. Invisibility wasn't permitted. Every glance demanded a quip, a twirl, or a well-aimed insult at someone else's expense. You were the world's most exhausted novelty act, forever one smirk away from being labeled boring. Even off-duty, you were watched. Stroll through the hall? Better strut. Pass the queen's table? Throw in an ironic wink. Sit quietly for 5 seconds? Someone would snap. Why isn't the fool fooling? And heaven forbid you showed real emotion. Sadness made people uneasy. Anger was dangerous. Quiet reflection? Suspicious. If you weren't grinning like a lunatic while hopping on one foot, they assumed you were plotting treason. Worse, you lived in the palace, but not like royalty. Your quarters were a broom closet near the kitchens, close enough to hear laughter but never to share it. You ate scraps, were hand-me-downs, and existed as a prop, not a person. And when the nobles got bored or irritable, guess who got summoned at midnight to fix it? Bad hunt? Sour wine? The king's dog coughed weirdly? Your door was knocked on with a hiss, do something funny. You weren't allowed to be, only to perform. The line between your true self and your jester persona blurred until you forgot who you'd been before the bells and forced smiles. In court, you didn't just wear the costume, you became it. And the show? It never ended. Being the jester sounds fun until you grasp the non-stop demand for humor. No off days. No moods. Your entire identity was a 24/7 laugh track, regardless of wars, funerals, or your own toothache. Your job? Be hilarious on command. Duke mourning his third wife? Kingdom at war? You woke up with a soul-crushing malaise? Doesn't matter. Juggle. Pun. Trip over a goose gracefully. And forget recycling material. Nobles wanted fresh jokes. That brilliant satire you labored over for a week? Great. Now produce 12 more by lunch, impersonate 3 courtiers, and mock the bishop's sermon. all while pretending to faceplant over poultry. Bomb. And you weren't just booed. You were beaten, pelted with chicken bones, or replaced. Medieval courts lacked HR. Offend the wrong noble, and your next gig might involve scrubbing chamber pots or digging your own grave. Remember, you were the only one forbidden to be serious. Everyone else could weep, rage, pray, or scheme. You juggled through tension, laughed off royal tantrums, and danced around politics in a stupid hat, your smile stapled in place. Not feeling it today? Invalid. Your worth hinged on squeezing chuckles from people who considered cruelty, wit, and sarcasm foreplay. So yes, being the funny one sounds glamorous, until your survival depends on entertaining folks who could legally execute you for a botched punchline. This wasn't stand-up comedy. It was medieval emotional hostage-taking. In court, the line between funny and offensive was a razor's edge, and you tiptoed across it blindfolded while juggling insults. Your job was to mock everyone: kings, queens, clergy, guests, but never too harshly, never too directly, never at the wrong moment. One misjudged quip about the king's waistline or the lord's fourth marriage, and you weren't the jester anymore. You were the fool who crossed the line. And here's the kicker: the line moved. On Monday, the queen giggled at your jab about her cousin's gambling. On Tuesday, with said cousin present, it was treason. By Thursday, guards escorted you out for disturbing decorum. There was no safe zone. Politics? Risky. Religion? Suicide. Royal failures? Absolutely forbidden, unless wrapped in 3 layers of metaphor and a juggling act. Some jesters mastered truth through absurdity, cloaking social critique in riddles or animal allegories. The rooster who crows too loud might find his eggs missing, you'd say, praying the king laughed instead of lopped your head off. But it was always a gamble. A noble's bad mood? Your neck. A bishop's bruised ego? Blasphemy charges. If the court turned on you, the same folks who once roared at your jokes would clutch their pearls and claim they'd never found you amusing. And no one would defend you. Jesters had no clergy immunity, no noble privilege. You were a fool with a revocable license to speak, what a monarch could void with a glare. Some jesters were whipped, others banished, some hanged. A few were retired, medieval code for buried without a funeral. So yes, humor was your weapon, but it was also your noose. And in court, timing was everything. Miss the beat, lose your head. Before you even speak, the room is already laughing at what you're wearing. As a medieval jester, your wardrobe wasn't designed for dignity, it was crafted for humiliation. The moment you stepped into court, your entire outfit screamed one thing: I'm not a person. I'm the punchline. Let's start with the hat, the infamous coxcomb. A multicolored, floppy monstrosity with horns and bells dangling from the tips. Bells. Not because they enhanced your performance, but because the nobility wanted to hear you coming, like some walking wind chime of shattered self-worth. Your tunic? A checkerboard of clashing colors no sane tailor would ever combine. Violent yellows slapped against blues, garish reds bleeding into greens, all stitched together like a tapestry woven by someone who despised your very existence. Your shoes? Curled toe slippers, also with bells, perfect for slipping on spilled mead or tripping over your own irrelevance. They made you look like a court-approved goblin, which, frankly, was the point. Even your belt was a joke, oversized or knotted in ways that rendered it useless. Need to carry a knife or pouch? Forget it. Your purpose wasn't practicality. You existed to jingle, dance, and faceplant in a glorified mascot costume. And while nobles draped themselves in velvet, silk, and gold-threaded embroidery, your clothes were cobbled from the cheapest wool and linen scraps. If the fabric itched, weighed you down, or bore suspicious stains. Perfect. The more uncomfortable, the better, because the audience needed constant reminding. You were beneath them. Now imagine wearing this get-up to every feast, wedding, and royal negotiation. No variations, no dignified alternatives, just 24/7 visual absurdity. Even when dead serious, you looked like a walking art project gone wrong. And compliments? Don't hold your breath. No one said, "Nice hat." Instead, you got, "Try not to trip over your bells today, fool." Or worse, someone yanking your sleeve just to hear you jingle, like a holiday decoration with abandonment issues. So yes, your attire was iconic. But it was also a uniform of degradation, a reminder that no matter how sharp your wit, your appearance must reassure the powerful you'd never truly threatened them. You were the court's designated absurdity, a jester in form and fabric. You slept under the same roof as dukes and kings, but make no mistake, you were part of the furniture, a living tapestry that occasionally made noise. Your room, if you were lucky, was a glorified storage closet tucked behind the kitchens or near the servants' quarters. Just close enough to be dragged out for a midnight joke or an awkward wedding toast, yet just far enough to reinforce your insignificance. At meals, you didn't sit with nobles. You hovered near them, close enough to overhear gossip, be insulted mid-bite, or dodge a chicken bone hurled at your head for comic effect. You might nibble from the same platters, but only after the nobles, priests, dogs, and occasionally the stable boy had their fill. Yet ironically, you heard everything: affairs, plots, whispered betrayals, the ugly truths behind polished marriages and treaties. You were the unwanted ear in the room, the invisible witness nobody bothered silencing because, in their minds, you were too insignificant to matter. But that knowledge? It was a double-edged sword. It could keep you alive or get you killed. Here's the cruel twist. You lived among nobility, swam in their secrets, ate their leftovers, yet socially, you were stranded. Nobles wouldn't befriend you. Servants didn't trust you. Too high for the lower ranks, too low for the elite. You floated in purgatory, tolerated but never respected. You were patted on the head like a trained bear, never welcomed as a guest. Dare to speak plainly, ask for a favor, or demand basic respect. The response was instant. Know your place, fool. You were the permanent outsider, mimicking the court, mocking the lords, entertaining the ladies, yet forever barred from land, titles, or honor. Your future was as fixed as those damned bells on your shoes. So yes, you lived with nobles. But you lived among them the way a shadow clings to light, ever present, never truly seen. You'd spent years honing skills that would make modern performers weep, juggling knives, composing biting satire, reciting poetry in multiple languages, mastering instruments, impersonating courtiers with lethal accuracy. Yet no one considered you talented. You were merely amusing. That was the jester's curse. No matter your brilliance, your genius was reduced to a party trick. Craft a political allegory disguised as a sheep joke? Someone lobbed a grape at your skull and sneered, "Don't get clever." Write verses that'd make poets weep? The nobles barked, did the funny face again. If a baron told a mediocre joke, it was bold. If you delivered the same line better, saucy, inappropriate. And if you dared outshine someone important, disaster. Nobles despised being upstaged, especially by a human Christmas ornament. So you played a delicate game, skilled enough to stay employed, but never so good you made power feel small. Be witty, but not wise. Sharp, but not threatening. A master of your craft who then juggled fruit to remind everyone you were just a fool. It was a balancing act on a blade's edge. And the real tragedy? Many jesters were virtuosos, musicians, acrobats, thinkers, forced to cloak their prowess behind a mask of buffoonery. Because brilliance in a fool's mouth was only palatable when served with a pratfall and a jingle. Worse, they laughed hardest when you failed. Slip mid-dance? Drop a juggling pin? Miss a punchline? That's when the hall erupted, not because you meant to flub, but because your mistakes confirmed their bias. You weren't clever. Just a ridiculous accident waiting to happen. So yes, your talent might be the finest in the room, but your applause? Always laced with condescension. Feasts in the medieval court were spectacles of excess. Glistening roasted meats, overflowing wine goblets, minstrels plucking lutes in the background. And you? You were the main course of humiliation. From the moment guests arrived, nobles eyed you like a toy to be prodded for their amusement. Do a trick, fool. Tell a joke. Imitate Lord Winsley's lazy eye. You performed not because you wanted to, but because the mood of 100 drunken nobles depended on your ability to swallow pride while being publicly mocked, groped, and possibly slapped. You didn't sit at the table. You orbited it like some dingling satellite of shame, moving from group to group like a courtly Roomba, vacuuming up awkward silences with a well-timed quip or ill-advised handstand. Always available, never invited. And when the wine flowed freely, that's when the real fun began. Your performance became a free-for-all game. Someone yanking your hat over your eyes, another demanding pig impressions, a third hurling a leg bone at your head and cackling when you flinched. Because here's the ugly truth, you weren't just entertainment. You were the court's emotional punching bag. Nobles couldn't insult each other directly, but they could eviscerate you. And they did, mocking your clothes, your voice, your peasant origins, your very humanity. Not out of hatred, but because you were convenient. Laughing at the jester made everyone feel superior, richer, safer. You were the pressure valve that kept the system running. So you smiled. You took it. You kept the laughter flowing because the alternative, silence, was dangerous. Silence meant tension. Silence meant attention shifting to someone more important who might find you lacking. You weren't celebrated at these feasts. You were consumed like the bread and wine, chewed up and forgotten by the time the tables were cleared. When nobles retired to their chambers, full and satisfied, you slunk back to your closet-sized room with bruised ribs and a smile that ached from forced merriment. By day, you were the jester, tossing quips, juggling apples, absorbing verbal abuse like a trained clown in a gilded cage. But by night, you became something far more dangerous, the king's secret weapon. The crown might laugh at your tumbles, but they valued you for something beyond slapstick, your ears. Being the fool came with an unexpected perk, invisibility in plain sight. Nobles spoke freely around you. Servants forgot you were there. Ambassadors spilled secrets while you pretended to fumble with their wine. You drifted through the castle like furniture with feet, collecting every whispered confession, every treasonous plot, every illicit affair confessed over goblets. And you remembered it all, not out of nosiness, but survival. Because eventually, the king would summon you privately. What did the bishop tell the French envoy last night, fool? And you'd better have the answer. Fail to report, and you might be suspected of loyalty to others. Report too much, and you'd be drawn deeper into the web. It was a deadly dance. The monarch prized your honesty until that honesty offended. You were expected to deliver truths, but only the right ones, wrapped in riddles if necessary. Who's sleeping with whose wife? Which lord plots light rebellion over mutton stew? The cruel irony? Everyone knew your role. Lords smiled at you but didn't trust you. Servants stiffened when you approached. Guards watched you like you carried a hidden dagger. And in a way, you did. Your weapon was information. And in a court of swords and secrets, the sharpest blade wasn't steel. It was the truth tucked behind a fool's grin. In this world, your job was to keep everyone laughing, even when you were breaking inside. Your dog died? Doesn't matter. The queen still expects jokes about her cousin's awful wig. Fever raging? Too bad. The duke had poor hunting and needs cheering before he smashes his plate. Heart shattered? Keep dancing, fool. It's a wedding, and you're not permitted feelings unless they're funny ones. Sadness was selfish. Anger was insubordination. Exhaustion? Laziness. Any emotion beyond cheerful absurdity was treason to your role. If you showed genuine pain, people grew uncomfortable, not from empathy, but because you'd failed your function. They didn't see a human with scars and sorrows. You were laugh furniture with a pulse, expected to absorb nobles' moods while reflecting none of your own. You performed through grief, through illness, through moments when you begged the universe for 5 minutes alone to crumble behind a curtain. But there were no curtains, no privacy. You were always on. Vulnerability had no place in your costume. And when nobles noticed your distress, they didn't ask what was wrong. They snapped. Why aren't you being funny today? Or worse, perhaps the fools finally cracked. Shall we find a new one? So what did you do? You weaponized your pain, turned heartbreak into punchlines, laughed louder and sooner so they couldn't laugh at you, built fortresses of wit around your exhaustion and never let anyone see inside. Because the moment they realized the fool was human, the illusion shattered, and so did your worth. Yes, you had feelings. You just learned to bury them under bells and buffoonery like everyone expected. Because in the medieval court, where others were free to feel, the fool's only permitted emotion was the pretense that nothing hurt. Medieval kings were notoriously temperamental. One bad dream, one overcooked roast, one ill-timed sneeze from a foreign diplomat, and the entire court's mood would darken like a thundercloud with a crown. And guess who bore the blame when royal brows furrowed? You. If the king wasn't smiling, clearly the fool had failed his duty. Never mind that you'd performed at a feast until dawn, that your voice was hoarse from singing, or that you'd already told 12 jokes that morning. If the monarch woke up grumpy, the court glared at you like you'd personally ruined breakfast. You weren't just the jester. You were the court's emotional insurance policy. Failed trade negotiations? The advisors muttered, perhaps the fool didn't lighten the tension enough. Queen scowling during mass? Must have been the jester's tasteless joke. King stubbed his toe on a chamber pot? Has the fool been leaving things about again? Sometimes the criticism came as subtle snipes, other times as direct threats. Entertain me, fool. My mood's foul and your head's in the balance. And they meant it. One poorly timed silence could demote you to stable cleaner, or worse, get you executed for being unfunny. Even when disasters weren't your fault, they became your burden. You were the human mood regulator, endlessly adjusting yourself so nobles stayed comfortable. But here's the rub. No one ever thanked you. If the king cheered up, they credited strong wine. If he laughed, someone else must have told the joke. If he didn't, your failure. Either way, you lost. So yes, in this viper's nest of paranoia, you, the jester, were paradoxically both insignificant and responsible for the kingdom's emotional climate. And if the king didn't laugh, start praying. You might live in the castle, wear bells on your hat, and exchange quips with kings, but make no mistake, you were more trapped than the dungeon prisoners. Because being a medieval court jester wasn't just a job, it was a life sentence and an identity that consumed you. Once branded the fool, there was no escape. No promotions, no career changes, no midlife pivots to merchant or monk. You were a permanent performer, whether you wanted to be or not. Age didn't grant reprieve. Illness brought no pension. There was no cozy cottage awaiting your retirement, just the same ridiculous costume on an increasingly frail body. You didn't become master your name. You remained the fool, just slower, sadder, and with fewer teeth. The cruelest cut? Even if you possessed genius, composing poetry, speaking 4 languages, understanding statecraft better than the royal council, no one would ever see past the bells. Warn of impending war? Ignored. Slip on a turnip? They'd howl for hours. You become a walking costume, your humanity drowned out by the jingling. And attempting to leave? Futile. You had no trade skills, no land, no connections beyond castle walls. Drift into a village, and you weren't that sharp-witted court performer, just a ragged madman babbling about dukes and drama. Survive exile? You'd still starve, forgotten, until some bored noble sighed, bring back the old fool. He made us laugh. Like a wind-up toy, you'd be dragged back. Because you weren't a man. You were their entertainment appliance, remembered only when their boredom needed curing. So you stayed. You performed. You laughed at your own unraveling because the alternative, freedom, was terrifying. Because once you were the fool, you died the fool. Here's the tragic irony. In chambers full of scheming nobles, pompous bishops, and preening knights, you might be the only one permitted to speak truth. Everyone else dealt in flattery and lies, diplomats with honeyed words, courtiers with poisoned smiles, servants with survivalist deceit. But you could say what others couldn't. Mock failed policies the king refused to reconsider. Satirize the baron embezzling grain. Impersonate the duchess sleeping with the bishop's nephew, and somehow survive it. But getting away with it didn't mean safety. It meant tightrope walking between comedy and execution. The court laughed because they pretended it was just a joke, but everyone knew better. That silly war commentary? Disguised political dissent. That playful tax joke? A peasant's rage in punchline form. You were the only honest voice in the room, and it terrified them. Some admired you quietly. Others hated you openly. All watched your every word. Because one quip too sharp, one truth too naked, and the same crown that chuckled at your wit could have your head rolling by morning. In a world where wrong words meant imprisonment, the jester was the court's truth serum, with no antidote. You were their living conscience in motley, allowed to point at the naked emperor, if you did it while juggling and squeaking in a silly voice. But if your truth cut too deep? If the king felt fragile that day? Well, jesters had been silenced before. So yes, in this den of secrets, your role was to shine light into shadows and pretend it was part of the act. Because sometimes, the bravest truth-teller wasn't the knight or scholar, just the man no one took seriously. You spent your life surrounded by people, nobles, knights, ladies, guests. Your voice echoed through feast halls, your jokes rang out at weddings, even funerals. And yet, when your time came, no one was there. The jester's existence was all noise, but his death? Always silence. You'd die in some forgotten corner room, unnoticed and unmourned. No parades, no eulogies, no marble tombstone etched with your best one-liner. You wouldn't be remembered like fallen warriors or poets. Just gone. Maybe the cook would mention you years later. Remember that fool who danced like a goat? Maybe your replacement would find your old bells in a drawer and never ask whose they were. Or maybe no one remembered at all, because another jester took your place before your corpse went cold. Because to them, you were never really a person, just a sound, a flash of color, a fleeting amusement, replaceable, disposable. The very trait that made you valuable, vanishing behind the joke, ensured you'd vanish from memory. You never married, never had heirs, never owned land or built a legacy. You made others feel important, but left no mark of your own. Even your closest court friend, that steward who once laughed at your bishop impression, wouldn't visit your grave. You might be buried outside the churchyard, deemed too sinful for consecrated ground. Too many jokes, not enough prayers. You lived for their laughter, measured your worth in their joy. But laughter is ephemeral. It echoes once, then fades. And when you're gone, the halls just grow quiet until the next fool arrives, juggling for applause. So yes, your life brought others cheer. You made kings forget troubles, lords drop pretenses. But when your candle finally sputtered out, no crowds, no fanfare, just silence. And perhaps, if the wind was right, the faintest jingle of bells, remembered by no one. To the lords and ladies of the medieval court, the jester was mere entertainment, comic relief in their world of politics and war. But look closer, and you'd see he wasn't just there to amuse. He was there to reflect. A walking contradiction, low-born yet allowed to mock kings, powerless yet speaking truth to power, ridiculed yet secretly feared. He stood at the center of every feast, jingling and spinning, not to be celebrated, but to force introspection. Because the jester was the court's funhouse mirror. His jokes revealed what no advisor dared say. His puns disguised political commentary. His impersonations exposed hypocrisy. Every laugh he provoked carried an uncomfortable aftertaste. Somewhere in the buffoonery lay uncomfortable truths. The fool was safe to laugh at, until he wasn't. Until his barbs hit too close to home. Until the room realized this man in motley understood them better than they cared to admit. And so he became more than an entertainer. He transformed into a living symbol. A reminder that power is fragile. That truth, even dressed as comedy, cuts deep. That laughter can be the deadliest weapon of all, sharper than any sword. In a world obsessed with hierarchy and order, the jester was the sanctioned exception. And that's what made him indispensable. He walked the halls of power not because he was respected, but because he embodied what the powerful feared most, being exposed as ridiculous, vulnerable, human. But the final joke wasn't on the nobles. It was on him. He sacrificed dignity, freedom, legacy, and peace of mind for the fleeting approval of people who'd never see him as an equal. His genius hid behind absurdity. His wisdom came wrapped in wordplay. His truths were dismissed as mere foolishness. Yet centuries later, we remember him, not as a mere clown, but as something far more complex, more haunting, more real. The medieval jester was never the joke. He was the warning that sometimes the only person speaking truth is the one you're busy laughing at. Long before theaters had curtains or actors took bows, ancient drama was born in a whirl of wine, masks, and divine madness. It didn't begin with playwrights or applause, but with Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, fertility, ritual ecstasy, and performance. In 6th century BCE Athens, theater wasn't just culture, it was cult. The earliest plays emerged during the city Dionysia, a spring festival honoring the god. Citizens flooded the streets in celebration. Livestock were sacrificed. Wine flowed like water. And amid this revelry, something miraculous happened. People started becoming others, not pretending, transforming. Choruses of up to 50 men moved in hypnotic rhythm, faces hidden behind masks, eyes blazing with ecstasy as they performed dithyrambs, wild, hymn-like chants that blurred the line between prayer and performance. These weren't actors as we know them, but vessels channeling divine energy. Then came Thespis. Legend says around 534 BCE, this man did the unthinkable. He stepped out of the chorus and spoke as a character. With that single act, the concept of the actor was born. That's why we still call performers thespians today. Imagine the shock. One man claiming to be someone else. To audiences, it must have seemed like blasphemy or magic. The Greeks were hooked. What began as sacred ritual evolved into structured storytelling. Playwrights like Aeschylus and Sophocles added second and third actors, introducing dialogue, plot, and dramatic conflict. But the spiritual core remained. Performances took place in massive open-air theaters carved into hillsides, like Athens' Theater of Dionysus, seating 17,000. The stage wasn't just for pretending, it was a portal to myth and meaning. So no, theater didn't begin with polite applause. It arrived drunk, masked, and screaming, a divine riot where the only script was possession. Because sometimes, the most profound truths emerge when we stop being ourselves and start becoming something more. As Greek theater matured, it became more than religious devotion. It became civilization's mirror, a reflection of Athenian fears, failures, and fleeting glories under the Mediterranean sun. But to understand this mirror, we must examine two things: tragedy and masks. Tragedy, tragödia, or goat song, remains foundational to storytelling. Its origins? Hazy and strange. The name might reference goats sacrificed to Dionysus, or the prize, an actual goat, given to winning performers. But by the 5th century BCE, it had crystallized into a formidable art form, structured, poetic, and relentlessly bleak. These plays dealt in fate, betrayal, vengeance, and hubris, with gods toying with mortals like cats with mice. At their heart stood the tragic hero, great but flawed, doomed by their own pride. Think Oedipus blinding himself after learning he's killed his father and married his mother. Think Antigone choosing death to bury her brother against the king's orders. And at the center of it all? Masks. Greek actors didn't just play roles, they transformed. A single performer, always male, might portray multiple characters using distinct masks, twisted mouths for sorrow, wide eyes for terror, delicate features for female roles. These weren't subtle props but oversized, stylized creations ensuring even the farthest spectator could read the emotion. Behind the mask, the actor's voice was everything. With no microphones, performers mastered projection and clarity. Their bodies became instruments, kneeling in grief, howling at the sky, all under open heavens. Playwrights like Aeschylus, who added a second actor, Sophocles, who added a third, and Euripides, who brought psychological depth, turned the stage into philosophical battlegrounds. Yet despite the darkness, Greek theater wasn't a funeral. It was celebration. Tragedies competed like Olympic events, with wealthy citizens funding productions as civic duty. The entire city attended, including the poor. The stage was sacred ground, and the mask? A tool of revelation. The Greeks had found a way to stare into the abyss and call it art. While tragedy wrestled with gods and fate, Greek comedy mooned the universe with its pants down. By the late 5th century BCE, as Athens blossomed into a cultural powerhouse, comedy emerged as its rebellious younger sibling, crude, irreverent, and loud as a drunken symposium. This was theater's ID unleashed, where no one, not even the Olympians, was safe from ridicule. If tragedy asked, "What is the meaning of suffering?" comedy retorted, "Why is Zeus such a pompous ass?" The undisputed master? Aristophanes, the Shakespeare of satire. His plays like Lysistrata, where women withhold sex to end war, The Clouds, mocking Socrates, and The Frogs, featuring a chorus of amphibious critics, were equal parts brilliant, bawdy, and brutal. Performed at the same Dionysian festivals right after tragic trilogies, these comedies were the ancient equivalent of Whiplash. Audiences would weep over Antigone's death, then roar as politicians got roasted by dancing sausages. The masks here weren't solemn. They were grotesque caricatures with bulging eyes, snub noses, and in some cases, outrageously oversized. Ahem, phalluses, because nothing says comedy like a walking dick joke. Costumes were padded to absurd proportions. Wigs looked electrocuted. Choruses might appear as birds, wasps, or clouds depending on the gag. But don't mistake this for mindless slapstick. Athenian comedy was viciously political. Aristophanes eviscerated warmongers, Lysistrata, philosophers, the clouds, and rival playwrights with surgical precision. His satire of Socrates was so savage, some scholars believe it fueled the public distrust that led to the philosopher's trial. As classical Athens waned, comedy softened. By the 4th century BCE, new comedy, pioneered by Menander, swapped biting satire for domestic farces, mistaken identities, romantic mishaps, clever slaves outwitting dumb masters. This became the blueprint for Roman comedy and eventually modern sitcoms. But the core remained. Comedy wasn't just laughter. It was truth-telling in disguise, democracy's way of holding a funhouse mirror to itself. When Rome inherited theater from Greece, they didn't whisper tragedies, they built colosseums and screamed, more blood, more spectacle. Roman theater was never just art. It was power, propaganda, and popcorn entertainment rolled into one. The early plays were Greek knockoffs. Playwrights like Livius Andronicus and Plautus jazzed up Athenian originals with extra slapstick, simpler plots, and raunchier jokes. The result? A Roman sitcom, mistaken identities, horny young lovers, and sassy slaves saving the day. Plautus and Terence perfected this formula, creating stock characters, the clever servant, the grumpy father, that still haunt comedy 2,000 years later. But Roman tragedy? Different beast entirely. While Greek tragedies were poetic and philosophical, Seneca's Roman versions dialed up the gore. Think Jesters, where a man unknowingly eats his own children. Not exactly dinner theater. Yet most Romans preferred their drama with extra circus, lavish staging with trapdoors, cranes, even real water effects. Some productions allegedly used condemned criminals for realism during death scenes, because nothing says artistic integrity like actual executions. Emperors quickly weaponized theater. Augustus used it for PR. Nero forced audiences to endure his terrible acting. Walking out equals death sentence. The stage became less about catharsis, more about control, less Sophocles, more WWE. Far from Rome's marble spectacles, another theatrical tradition blossomed in ancient India, one where combat, medicine, and spirituality intertwined. Indian theater didn't erupt from wine festivals, but from sacred texts, particularly the Natya Shastra circa 200 BCE, 200 CE. This wasn't just an acting manual, it was cosmic blueprint, claiming theater was a divine gift to educate and uplift humanity. The text codified everything: stage architecture, character archetypes, gestures, 72 distinct eye movements alone, even how plays should affect audiences emotionally through rasa, essence. Performances weren't mere stories, but spiritual experiences, whether invoking Shringara, love, Karuna, compassion, or Raudra, fury. Training was grueling. Actors mastered mudras, symbolic hand gestures, lyrical dialogue, and movements inspired by nature. The great playwright Kalidasa, circa 4th century CE, crafted works like Shakuntala, a masterpiece blending romance and metaphysics. Unlike Greek theater's public spectacle, Indian drama balanced elite Sanskrit performances with folk traditions, shadow puppetry, dance dramas like Kathakali, and regional forms where every flick of a wrist carried meaning. Here, theater wasn't about holding a mirror to society but harmonizing with the cosmos. The actor wasn't an entertainer but a bridge between myth and reality, performing not for applause, but for enlightenment. In ancient China, theater didn't burst onto the scene with a dramatic entrance, it unfolded gradually like an intricate silk scroll. Long before written scripts and professional actors, there were shamanic rituals, ceremonial dances, and court performances blending movement with meaning. Chinese theatrical tradition stretched back over 3 millennia to the Zhou dynasty, where masked nuoc dances warded off evil spirits, not for entertainment, but as solemn spiritual acts. Over centuries, these rituals absorbed storytelling elements, evolving into something richer. By the Tang dynasty, 7th to 10th century CE, a distinct theatrical form emerged, one balancing aesthetics, discipline, and philosophy. Emperor Xuanzong established the Pear Garden, the first imperial acting academy, where performers trained in voice, dance, acrobatics, and precise gestures. To this day, Chinese actors are still called children of the Pear Garden. But Chinese drama truly flourished during the Yuan dynasty, 13th to 14th centuries, under Mongol rule. With Confucian censorship relaxed, a vibrant popular theater blossomed. Zaju poetic dramas took center stage, structured yet playful, featuring strong female leads, sometimes played by actual women, a rarity in global theater history. Playwrights like Guan Hanqing crafted masterpieces such as The Injustice to Do Yi, blending emotional depth with social critique. Chinese opera as we know it, particularly Peking opera, crystallized later, during the Ming and Qing dynasties. This wasn't naturalistic theater but symbolic storytelling, elaborate color-coded makeup, stylized movements, piercing falsetto vocals, and minimal sets that transformed empty stages into mountains or battlefields through movement alone. Every tilt of the head, every sleeve flourish carried coded meaning. Unlike Western theater's pursuit of realism, Chinese opera sought essence, not imitation of life, but its distilled spirit. Meanwhile, halfway across the world in 14th century Japan, an entirely different theatrical philosophy was taking shape. No theater didn't clamor for attention, it demanded stillness, reverence, and a willingness to dwell in the spaces between notes. Emerging from folk dances and Buddhist chants, No was refined by Kanami and his son Zimi into an art form where less wasn't just more, it was everything. A No performance feels like watching a dream unfold in slow motion. The Shite, main actor, moves with glacial precision, often behind a carved wooden mask whose expression seems to shift with the light. The stage is bare except for a painted pine tree backdrop. The dialogue is chanted, accompanied by sparse flute and drum. Many plays feature ghosts, warriors, lovers, madwomen, returning to resolve earthly attachments. This isn't entertainment, it's meditation in motion. Zimi's treatises on No emphasized Yugen, mysterious beauty found in subtlety. The greatest moments often happened in pauses, when the mask's angle changed slightly or a sleeve rustled with unspoken meaning. Supported by samurai patrons, No became aristocratic art, not for cheering crowds, but for contemplating eternity. 6 centuries later, performances remain virtually unchanged, making No the oldest continuously performed theater tradition on Earth. While nobles obsessed over No's restrained elegance, another theatrical form thrived in the shadows, puppetry. Across Asia, puppets weren't children's toys but vessels for myth, morality, and subversive truths too dangerous for human actors to voice. In Indonesia, wayang kulit shadow puppetry transformed buffalo hide into divine drama. Behind a backlit screen, the dalang puppet master manipulated intricate silhouettes while voicing entire epics like the Mahabharata. More than entertainment, wayang was sacred ritual performed at temples, births, and funerals. The dalang wasn't just an entertainer, but a spiritual guide, comedian, and philosopher rolled into one. Japan's bunraku puppetry took a different approach. These weren't shadows but 3-foot-tall, hyper-realistic figures operated by 3 visible puppeteers in perfect synchrony, one controlling the head and right arm, another the left arm, the third the legs. It took decades to earn the right to touch a puppet's head. The effect? Uncanny humanity, a puppet woman wiping tears with her sleeve, a warrior trembling before death. The narration came from a single chanter beside a shamisen player, his voice shape-shifting between thunder, whispers, and weeping. Puppetry thrived because it could say the unsayable. In repressive societies, puppets mocked emperors, questioned fate, and enacted forbidden romances without consequence. After all, it wasn't you criticizing the king, just some wooden strings. Whether through flickering shadows or bunraku's lifelike movements, puppet theater held up mirrors to the human condition, proving sometimes the deepest truths come from things that were never alive. From Dionysian ecstasy to No's stillness, from Roman spectacles to wayang shadows, ancient theater didn't vanish, it evolved. The Greeks gave us dramatic structure, 3-act plots, character arcs, the tragic hero's flaw, concepts that still shape every Netflix series. Roman amphitheaters became the blueprint for modern stadiums. Their comedies inspired sitcom tropes we still recycle today. India's Raza theory influences how films manipulate emotions. Chinese opera's symbolic movements echo in martial arts cinema. No's minimalism inspired directors like Kurosawa. And puppetry? It lives everywhere from children's TV to cutting-edge animation. But the real legacy isn't in techniques or tropes, it's in the human need to perform, to step outside ourselves and return transformed. Every TikTok skit, every Broadway musical, every school play participates in this ancient lineage. Because theater was never just about pretending. It was and remains our oldest method of asking what if, while staring unflinchingly at what is. Sinane was forged in blood and steel from the moment she drew breath. Her father, Philip II of Macedon, had hammered a fractured kingdom into a war machine. Her mother, Adada, was an Illyrian princess raised by warriors who considered combat as natural as breathing. While most Macedonian noblewomen were groomed for diplomacy and weaving, Sinane was bred for battle, a blade hidden in the royal household's silken folds. From her first steps, Sinane straddled 2 brutal legacies, her father's tactical genius and her mother's unbreakable warrior spirit. While other girls mastered embroidery, she learned to wield a spear. Adada, unlike traditional Macedonian queens, actively trained her daughter in Illyrian combat techniques. In her mother's homeland, women fought alongside men as equals, their strength not just accepted but demanded. Sinane's childhood was one of relentless discipline. She rode horses across jagged terrain until her thighs burned, practiced swordplay under the scorching sun, and studied military formations while her peers memorized poetry. In Pella's palace corridors, she absorbed statecraft by lurking at the edges of war councils, watching how generals deferred to Philip, learning early that power is never given, only taken. Being Philip's daughter brought privilege, but also peril. Her half-brother Alexander, born to Olympias, would eclipse all others in their father's eyes. The court simmered with intrigue and murders, exiles, shifting alliances were the norm in Macedon's cutthroat politics. But Sinane was no passive observer. Even as a child, she cultivated presence through sheer force of will. She trained harder, spoke bolder, rode faster than anyone expected. She knew her name would never command the reverence of Alexander's, but she resolved to carve her legacy in the spaces between empires. By adolescence, she wasn't just respected, she was feared. Not merely for her royal blood, but for her refusal to conform. Macedonian noblewomen were expected to be ornaments. Sinane became a weapon. While Alexander studied with Aristotle, she drilled with soldiers. When diplomats visited, she analyzed their weaknesses instead of stitching tapestries. She wasn't raised to survive in a man's world. She was trained to dominate it. To be born royal in Macedon was to be born into a deadly game of strategy. But to be Alexander the Great's half-sister? That meant living on a knife's edge. Sinane and Alexander shared Philip's blood, but their mothers, Olympias and Adada, couldn't have been more different. Olympias, infamous for her ambition and ruthlessness. Adada, an Illyrian who valued strength above all else. From childhood, Sinane understood she would never inherit the throne, that destiny belonged to Alexander, the golden boy with the lion's mane and philosopher's education. The court adored him, generals feared him, history would eventually kneel before him. But Sinane didn't kneel. As Alexander grew into legend, she carved a different path, sharper, quieter, but no less dangerous. While he conquered Persia, she mastered Macedon's internal politics. She observed how alliances shifted like desert sands, how a single misspoken word could topple dynasties. The battlefield wasn't always fought with swords. Sometimes the deadliest weapons were whispers. Yet she was no cloistered noblewoman. Stories of her military prowess spread, her skill with weapons, her tactical mind, her ability to lead troops. She may not have marched across continents, but she possessed something Alexander never did: patience. Sinane didn't need the world's attention. She needed her enemies to underestimate her. In a kingdom obsessed with lineage, her blood was both burden and advantage. As Philip's daughter and Alexander's sister, she was royalty. But her Illyrian heritage connected her to another warrior culture entirely. She could unite kingdoms or break them. She never challenged Alexander directly. There were no dramatic confrontations. But her mere existence was a quiet revolution, proof that power wasn't exclusively male. Her presence, her skills, her lineage were threats. Silent ones, but threats nonetheless. And when Alexander marched east chasing immortality, Sinane remained, watching, waiting, studying the gears of empire. Because even the greatest shadow can't cover everything. Not forever. Sinane refused to be confined to the role of a passive royal woman. While Alexander built his empire abroad, she carved her own battlefield at home, and unlike most noble women of her time, she didn't lead from behind palace walls. She rode into combat wearing armor, commanded troops with the authority of a seasoned general, and fought on horseback like the Illyrian warriors of her mother's bloodline. Her defining moment came when she led a military campaign into Illyria, the very land of her maternal ancestors. This wasn't some symbolic procession. Sinane actively directed strategy, organized supply lines, and engaged in frontline combat. In an era when even noblemen often avoided the fray, a royal woman charging into battle was both shocking and revolutionary. And she didn't just participate, she triumphed. This victory wasn't merely a flex of martial skill. It was a declaration written in blood and steel. Sinane was staking her claim not as a noblewoman with passing military interests, but but as a legitimate commander who had proven herself under fire. Her Illyrian heritage, once viewed as a curious footnote, now burned at her core. By conquering in Illyria, she accomplished something extraordinary. She carved out a sphere of influence independent of Alexander's colossal shadow. While her brother chased glory in Persia, Sinane was building something more enduring in the West: respect, loyalty, and a reputation untethered from anyone else's name. But power granted to women always comes with a price. Back in Macedon, the court buzzed with unease. Alexander, preoccupied with his eastern campaigns, didn't intervene, but his absence created a vacuum, and Sinane knew better than anyone how dangerous such spaces could become. She wasn't fighting just for personal glory. A mother now, she intended to secure her legacy through her daughter, Adea. Her marriage to Amyntas, a man with royal blood but little political strength, had been strategic, binding her line closer to the throne. When Amyntas died, likely another casualty of Macedonian power struggles, Sinane didn't retreat, she advanced. She raised Adea not as a decorative princess, but as a future queen. From childhood, the girl trained in rhetoric, statecraft, and crucially, combat. Sinane personally oversaw her education, determined that her daughter would wield both sword and political influence. This wasn't mere legacy building, it was survival instinct. With Alexander's empire fracturing and no clear heir, succession loomed like a storm cloud. Sinane devised a bold plan. Adea would marry Philip III, Alexander's half-brother, a mentally limited figurehead controlled by regents. If successful, this union would place Sinane at the center of power as the true force behind the throne. It was more than ambition, it was an attempt to stabilize a crumbling empire. While generals carved up Alexander's conquests, she sought to preserve Macedonian unity through her bloodline. But the world wasn't ready for a woman who moved like a king. Whispers became warnings. The regent Perdiccas, one of Alexander's former generals, saw the threat clearly. A warrior queen raising a daughter with a claim to the throne was intolerable. When Sinane prepared to travel with Adea to secure the marriage, she anticipated resistance, but not the betrayal awaiting her on the road. She had trained her daughter for the throne. Now she would pay the ultimate price for that audacity. Sinane knew the stakes when she set out for Asia with her daughter Adea. This wasn't a diplomatic visit. It was a calculated power play that could reshape the crumbling Macedonian empire. The marriage between Adea and King Philip III Aridius would cement her bloodline's claim to the throne, positioning her as the true power behind the puppet monarch. But the men controlling the regency saw things differently. To Perdiccas, the ambitious general ruling as regent, Sinane wasn't a royal matriarch, she was an existential threat. A woman who commanded her own army, possessed strategic brilliance, and worse still, enjoyed widespread popularity among Macedonian troops. Soldiers revered her. The common people saw her as Philip II true heir in spirit. Her daughter Adea carried the Arcad bloodline's prestige, the charisma of a born leader, and now, with this marriage, a direct path to the throne. Perdiccas couldn't allow it. As Sinane and Adea crossed into Asia Minor, they were ambushed by forces under Alcides, Perdiccas' own brother. What followed was a chilling demonstration of Macedonian realpolitik. Sinane, though unarmed, stood her ground with the unshakable defiance of a woman who had spent her life facing down impossible odds. Some accounts claim she tried to rally the soldiers against the regents on the spot. Others say she demanded to see the king himself. But it was too late. The order had been given. The assassination was swift and brutal. Sinane fell not in glorious battle, but to political treachery, stabbed for daring to imagine a world where women could wield power openly. The irony? The very soldiers ordered to kill her reportedly mutinied afterward. To Macedonian warriors, murdering Philip's daughter, a proven commander in her own right, was sacrilege. The backlash forced Perdiccas into a stunning reversal. He allowed Adea's marriage to proceed after all. But the damage was done. Macedon had lost one of its most capable leaders, not to foreign enemies, but to its own patriarchal fears. Sinane died without armor, yet her strategy lived on through Adea. Now renamed Eurydice, the young queen would wield her mother's legacy like a blade. Eurydice didn't remain the meek princess Perdiccas expected. In a bold power move, she shed her childhood name for one echoing Macedonia's ancient queens, a declaration she wouldn't be controlled. Though Philip III was mentally unfit to rule, Eurydice became the active voice of the throne, taking the unprecedented step of addressing the army directly in full military regalia. These weren't empty gestures. When she spoke before battle-hardened veterans, men who had followed Alexander to the ends of the earth, they listened. Her speeches promised a return to Arcad glory, stability, and Macedonian pride. She channeled her mother's unyielding spirit, and for a fleeting moment, it worked. The troops rallied to her. But the wars of the Diadochi were already tearing Alexander's empire apart. Eurydice found herself trapped between rival generals, Cassander, Polyperchon, Antipater, each vying for control. Her greatest adversary emerged in Olympias, Alexander's mother, who returned from exile with vengeance in her heart. Their clash wasn't just personal, it was a battle for Macedonia's soul between two visions of power, the old Arcad dynasty versus the new warlord era. When Eurydice marched against Olympias, her forces abandoned her at the critical moment. Facing the legendary mother of Alexander, many soldiers lost nerve. Captured alongside Philip III, the crown was ripped from her head. What followed wasn't politics, it was ritualized annihilation. Olympias forced Eurydice to witness Philip's execution before giving her a choice: suicide by poison or the noose. The daughter of Sinane chose the rope, dying as she had lived, defiant to the end. Their bodies were left unburied for days, a warning to any woman daring to claim power. In death, Eurydice accomplished what her killers feared most: she became legend. Though her reign lasted mere months, her defiance echoed through history. She had inherited her mother's steel and shared her fate, proving that even silenced, women could shape empires. Sinane and Eurydice have been relegated to history's footnotes, overshadowed by their male relatives, Alexander's conquests, Philip's reforms, Olympias' ruthlessness. But if you scrape away the layers of male-centered historiography, their story emerges as one of the ancient world's most compelling narratives of resistance. They weren't just royal women, they were a dynasty of defiance, proving power could wear a dress as well as armor. What makes their legacy extraordinary isn't merely that they challenged the system, but how they did it. Sinane didn't just ride into battle, she won a military campaign, earning the respect of hardened Macedonian soldiers. Eurydice didn't just marry a king, she became the power behind the throne, addressing armies with the authority of a seasoned commander. Their achievements would be remarkable for any leader, male or female, in that brutal era. The tragedy lies in how close they came to succeeding. In another timeline, Sinane might have ruled as regent, stabilizing Macedon after Alexander's death. Eurydice could have ushered in a new era where royal women weren't just pawns but players. Instead, both were killed not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well at claiming power in a world that reserved it for men. Modern scholars are finally rediscovering them, not as side characters in Alexander's saga, but as protagonists of their own epic. The fragments that survive tell a revealing story. Roman historian Polyaenus recording Sinane's Illyrian campaign, a handful of coins bearing Eurydice's name, the shocked reactions of soldiers who witnessed their murders. These aren't marginalia, they're proof of how thoroughly patriarchal history suppressed their stories. What survives reveals a blueprint for resistance. Sinane demonstrated that women could be both mothers and military commanders. Eurydice proved they could wear armor and crowns with equal authority. Neither needed permission to lead, they simply did, forcing the world to contend with their existence. Their erasure wasn't inevitable, it was deliberate, a warning to other ambitious women. Yet their fire couldn't be fully extinguished. Centuries later, their names resurfaced like embers in the dark. Sinane's combat skills became legendary enough for Polyaenus to record them. Eurydice's brief reign left enough traces that modern historians recognize her as one of antiquity's first queens to actively govern. Even their deaths carried power: the outrage of Macedonian troops at Sinane's assassination, the symbolism of Eurydice choosing her own end. In the end, they represent a road not taken, a glimpse of how different ancient Macedonia might have been had it embraced female leadership. Would Sinane's strategic mind have preserved Alexander's empire? Could Eurydice's charisma have united the warring Diadochi? We'll never know. But the question itself is their victory. Because history is written by victors, and for millennia, the stories of powerful women were systematically erased or distorted. Sinane became that warrior princess in footnotes, Eurydice was reduced to Philip III's wife. But archaeology and re-examined texts are restoring their complexity, not as anomalies, but as exemplars of what women could achieve when allowed to wield power. Their true legacy isn't in what they accomplished, though that was remarkable, but in what they represented, the lived proof that women could command armies, govern states, and shape history when given the chance. Every time a modern historian pieces together their story, every time their coins are displayed in museums, they posthumously win the battle their killers thought they'd ended. Sinan and Eurydice didn't survive their world, but they disrupted it irrevocably. Their crowns were stolen, their stories nearly erased, yet their defiance still echoes. Not as ghosts of a forgotten past, but as reminders that some fires burn too bright to be smothered, even by centuries of silence. Before belts denoted martial arts mastery or cinematic fight scenes became spectacles, humanity's earliest combat systems emerged from the sacred intersection of survival and spirituality. Across ancient civilizations, fighting wasn't merely practical, it was profoundly ritualistic, woven into the fabric of cultural identity, community protection, and cosmic order. The first martial arts didn't spring from sport or entertainment, but necessity. Long before written language, our ancestors were already developing systematic approaches to grappling, striking, and weapons training. But over millennia, these survival skills transcended their violent origins, evolving into disciplines that married physical prowess with philosophical depth. Early hunters' lunges and evasions became foundational techniques. Every skirmish and battlefield confrontation refined the movements that would later be codified into martial forms. What began as instinctual combat gradually transformed into something greater, a physical language passed down through generations, each movement carrying layers of meaning. Strikes mimicked animal attacks, stances mirrored natural elements, sequences embodied mythological battles between gods. The warrior's body became a living text, his techniques both combat methods and sacred invocations. This pattern manifested globally. In the Indus Valley, for 1,000-year-old seals depict figures and stances eerily similar to modern martial postures. African tribal wrestling formed core coming-of-age rituals. Mesopotamian soldiers trained in organized formations while Egyptian tomb paintings show intricate grappling techniques. Everywhere, combat was more than fighting. It was cultural expression, spiritual practice, and identity. Ancient warriors were buried with their weapons not as tools, but as extensions of self. A sword laid beside a skeleton wasn't just grave goods, it proclaimed this was a warrior to eternity. The earliest martial arts weren't extracurricular activities. They were essential rites of passage that connected the physical, mental, and divine. This wasn't about violence, it was about becoming. In the mist-shrouded hills of southern India lies the birthplace of what many consider the world's oldest martial art, Kalaripayattu. Emerging over 3,000 years ago in Kerala, this system wasn't just combat training, but a holistic discipline integrating medicine, spirituality, and movement. The name itself reveals its essence, Kalari, meaning training ground, Payattu, meaning to fight or practice. According to tradition, the sage Parasurama shaped Kalaripayattu as both martial system and spiritual path. Training began in sacred spaces where students entered with ritual reverence, bowing to the earth, the gods, and their guru. The physical training was grueling, Mapayata body conditioning sequences that resembled liquid dance, enhancing flexibility and agility before students ever touched weapons. The arsenal was vast: wooden staffs, curved swords, spears, and the legendary Urumi, a flexible whipsword so dangerous it demanded absolute bodily control. But equally important was the study of Ayurveda and philosophy. Kalaripayattu wasn't just about taking life, it was about understanding and preserving it. The perfect warrior, according to its tenets, balanced strength with compassion, skill with humility. When foreign invaders came, first Portuguese, then British, they suppressed Kalaripayattu as a threat. But like water, it found cracks to flow through, surviving disguised as folk dance and healing arts. Today, it stands not just as a fighting system, but as a living bridge to one of humanity's earliest visions of the warrior sage ideal, where combat mastery and spiritual enlightenment were inseparable paths. When most people hear martial arts, one phrase instantly comes to mind: Kung Fu. But in China, Gong Fu carries far deeper meaning. It signifies mastery achieved through dedicated effort, whether in combat, calligraphy, or cooking. Nowhere is this philosophy more perfectly embodied than in China's ancient martial traditions, born in temple courtyards, mountain retreats, and blood-soaked battlefields over 4,000 years ago. The earliest records from the Zhou dynasty describe military drills and weapon techniques, but Chinese martial arts truly blossomed where philosophy met fists in the quiet discipline of Buddhist monasteries. The legendary Shaolin Temple, nestled in the Song Mountains, became the crucible where combat transformed into spiritual art. According to tradition, the Indian monk Bodhidharma arrived in the 5th century CE, introducing meditation practices that would evolve into Shaolin Kung Fu. Observing monks weakened by endless seated meditation, Bodhidharma developed physical exercises to strengthen body and mind. These movements, inspired by animals and synchronized with breath, gradually crystallized into sophisticated combat systems. Each style embodied distinct principles: the tiger's explosive power, the crane's graceful balance, the snake's fluid precision. Every technique was more than physical, it was metaphysical, a way to channel qi, life energy, and harmonize yin-yang forces within. Shaolin monks weren't mere fighters. They were spiritual athletes who believed true mastery required conquering the self before opponents. Their training halls echoed with paradoxical maxims: attack with stillness, defend by yielding. The softest water wears away the hardest stone. This philosophy permeated other Chinese styles too. Taoist monks in Wudong Mountains developed internal arts like Tai Chi, where combat effectiveness emerged from relaxation and breath control rather than muscular force. Through dynasties and revolutions, Chinese martial arts endured as living philosophy. They taught that the ultimate enemy wasn't the opponent before you, but the anger, fear, and ego within. To fight without hatred, to win without arrogance, this was the Gong Fu ideal. Because in China, true martial arts were never about violence. They were about achieving perfect balance between action and stillness, between the warrior and the sage. Meanwhile, in the dust of Greek stadiums, another ancient martial art was forging warriors through brutal poetry, pankration. Meaning all powers, this was the original no-holds-barred combat sport, introduced at the 648 BCE Olympics. Imagine MMA without weight classes or time limits, just two men fighting until one surrendered or died. The rules? No biting, no eye gouging. Everything else, strikes, kicks, chokes, joint breaks, was fair game. Yet pankration wasn't mindless brutality. Fighters trained with scientific precision in the Palestra wrestling school, studying anatomy to exploit weaknesses, how to dislocate shoulders, rupture spleens, or snap necks with terrifying efficiency. Their techniques were battlefield tested. When Greek hoplites lost their spears and swords, they fought with pankration. The greatest champions became legends, like Arikian, who won an Olympic match posthumously by locking a submission hold as he died. What made pankration extraordinary was its holistic approach. Victories required not just strength, but strategy, pain tolerance, and mental fortitude. A pancratius training incorporated gymnastics, dietetics, and psychological conditioning, an ancient precursor to modern combat sports science. When Rome conquered Greece, pankration faded, replaced by gladiatorial spectacles. But its DNA survives in wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and MMA, proof that the Greeks understood combat's essence over 2 millennia ago. While Greek athletes competed for olive wreaths, ancient Egyptian warriors were fighting for something more profound: the preservation of cosmic order, Ma'at. The earliest evidence comes from Beni Hassan's tomb paintings, circa 2000 BCE, depicting over 400 grappling techniques with startling sophistication. For Egyptians, martial skill wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Young nobles trained in wrestling and stick fighting as spiritual preparation, their bodies becoming instruments of divine will. The Egyptian military developed systematic training in archery, spear work, and chariot warfare, an early form of mobile combat requiring split-second coordination. But their most fascinating martial legacy is Tadib, the ceremonial stick fighting that endures today as a dance-like ritual. What began as battlefield training evolved into a symbolic art where every parry and strike carried philosophical meaning. In Egyptian cosmology, warriors emulated gods like Horus, not mindless killers, but protectors of universal harmony. To fight was to participate in the eternal struggle against chaos. Their weapons weren't mere tools. They were extensions of the warrior's soul, buried with them to serve in the afterlife. This sacred dimension, where combat became ritual, where the warrior's body became temple, distinguished Egyptian martial traditions from mere violence. Long before the word samurai echoed through Japanese history, the island's martial identity was already taking shape in the misty valleys and rugged coastlines of ancient Japan. The origins of Japanese martial arts didn't begin in formal dojos or with katana duels, but in primal rituals, clan warfare, and spiritual discipline that would eventually crystallize into the Bushido code. During the Yayoi and Kofun periods, 300 BCE, 538 CE, combat techniques were practical and unrefined: bronze weapons, stone-tipped arrows, and raw survival instincts. But even then, fighting carried deeper significance. It was tribal identity, loyalty to clan, and family woven into every movement. Warriors weren't just individuals, they were living extensions of their bloodline's honor. The real transformation came during the Heian period, 794 to 1185 CE, when mounted archery became the pinnacle of martial excellence. The ideal warrior wasn't a mindless brute, but a cultured fighter poet, the proto-samurai known as bushi. These men, and occasionally women, practiced kyujitsu archery with the asymmetrical yumibao, requiring incredible strength and precision. But their training went deeper: breath control, mental focus, and the beginnings of what would become Zen mindfulness in combat. Swordsmanship existed, but early kinjutsu was brutally practical, far from the elegant katana duels of later centuries. In these battlefield-tested techniques, every slash was economy of motion, every parry a matter of life and death. Yet within these raw movements, a philosophy was growing that true mastery balanced combat skill with moral character. By the Kamakura period, 1185 to 1333 CE, this ethos hardened into Bushido, the way of the warrior, where honor, loyalty, and self-discipline became as vital as victory itself. What made Japanese martial arts unique was their inseparable bond with spirituality. Archery became kyudo, not just shooting, but meditation in motion. Swordsmanship evolved into kendo, where perfecting a strike was akin to achieving enlightenment. Even unarmed combat like jujitsu wasn't merely about defeating opponents, but about harmonizing with forces greater than oneself. The warrior wasn't just expected to fight well, but to die well, with perfect composure. This was martial arts as sacred art, where every technique was a step towards self-realization. Across the African continent, another martial legacy flourished, one largely ignored by mainstream histories. From the House of People's Dam boxing to Zulu stick fighting, these weren't mere combat systems, but cultural cornerstones where fighting, music, and spirituality merged into powerful traditions. In West Africa, Dam, originally practiced by butchers' guilds and warriors, combined bare-knuckle strikes with low kicks. Fighters wrapped one spear hand in cloth, leaving the other free for defense. More than sport, these matches were ritual spectacles set to drumbeats, where combatants sought spiritual blessings from marabouts, holy men, before bouts. The Hausa believed victory required both physical skill and divine favor, a concept echoing through many African martial traditions. Further south, the Zulu perfected their own warrior arts. Young boys trained in gumi, stick fighting, as part of initiation rites, developing reflexes and courage for future warfare. The legendary Shaka Zulu later adapted these techniques into revolutionary battlefield tactics. Each movement in these arts, whether a defensive block or offensive strike, was timed to rhythmic chants, transforming combat into a kind of lethal dance. What united these diverse African systems was their communal essence. Unlike the solitary samurai ideal, African martial arts were collective experiences, fighters supported by drummers, singers, and elders passing down oral traditions. Combat wasn't just individual prowess, it was cultural continuity, a way to transmit history and values through generations of warriors. When colonial powers suppressed these arts, many survived disguised as dances or rituals, testament to their deep roots in African identity. The indigenous peoples of the Americas developed equally sophisticated combat systems long before European contact. From the Aztec macuahuitl, obsidian-studded war clubs, to Inca bolas weapons, these weren't crude tools but refined martial technologies honed over centuries. Aztec warriors trained from childhood in Telpacali youth houses, where they mastered the macuahuitl, a wooden sword embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades that could decapitate a horse. But their training wasn't just physical, it was spiritual preparation. Warfare was sacred, a way to capture prisoners for ritual sacrifice and earn honor in the afterlife. Elite orders like the Eagle and Jaguar warriors weren't just soldiers, they were holy warriors embodying animal spirits through combat. Further south, the Inca developed systematic military training despite having no written language. Young warriors endured grueling tests of strength and endurance, mastering slings, spears, and maces. Their battlefield strategies, adapted to mountainous terrain, were so effective they built an empire spanning thousands of miles. Like the Aztecs, Inca warfare had spiritual dimensions. Victory wasn't just political, but a sign of divine favor. Among North American tribes like the Lakota and Comanche, martial arts were inseparable from cultural identity. Young warriors learned stealth, horsemanship, and ambush tactics through hunting and intertribal conflicts. But their training wasn't just technical, it emphasized humility, patience, and loyalty to the tribe. War dances weren't mere performances, they were moving prayers that prepared body and spirit for battle. What connected these diverse traditions was their holistic worldview. Native American martial arts weren't about dominating opponents but maintaining balance between tribes, with nature, and within the warrior's own spirit. Weapons weren't just tools but sacred objects. Combat wasn't just violence but a ritual act. When colonialism nearly erased these arts, some survived through oral traditions and cultural revival, proving their enduring power. From the samurai Zen archery to Zulu stick fighting, from Shaolin temples to Aztec warrior schools, ancient martial arts shared a profound truth. True mastery wasn't about destruction, but creation, forging better warriors, better communities, better human beings. They remind us that before belts and championships, martial arts were paths to something greater, ways to touch the divine through disciplined movement, to write philosophy with fists and feet. The ancient world's martial arts didn't vanish with the collapse of empires. They evolved, scattered like seeds across continents, taking root in unexpected places. What began as survival skills and sacred rituals transformed into the combat systems we recognize today, their DNA detectable in everything from Olympic sports to Hollywood fight choreography. The Greek pancrationt's legacy pulses through modern MMA cages, where fighters still employ its brutal clinch work and submissions. When a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner sinks in a chokehold, they're executing techniques that would feel familiar to a 5th century BCE Athenian athlete. The Roman appetite for spectacle lives on in professional wrestling's theatrical violence, less about authentic combat than the pageantry of domination. China's martial philosophy permeates global culture differently. Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do wasn't just a fighting style, it was the embodiment of ancient Chinese principles adapted for the modern world. His famous dictum, "Be like water," directly channels the Taoist concepts underlying Tai Chi and Shaolin training. Today, when a personal trainer discusses mind-body connection, they're unknowingly referencing ideas first systematized in the Wudong Mountains over a millennium ago. Japan's Bushido code found new life in 20th century martial arts. Judo's founder Kano Jigoro distilled lethal samurai techniques into a safe sport while preserving their ethical core. The katana's killing strokes became the controlled strikes of kendo. Even the ritualized bowing in modern dojos echoes the precise etiquette of Edo period training halls. What was once preparation for battlefield death is now a path to personal growth, the sword transformed into a moral compass. More surprising are the African martial traditions that survived slavery's Middle Passage. Capoeira, born in Brazilian slave quarters, disguised lethal kicks as dance to evade persecution. Its Jenga rhythm and acrobatics contain echoes of Angolan combat games. Similarly, Haitian slaves preserved ancestral fighting knowledge through But, a kicking art camouflaged as folk dance. These weren't just martial arts, they were acts of cultural resistance, ensuring warrior lineages endured against impossible odds. Native American combat systems faced near-total eradication, but fragments persist. The Oklahoma Choctaw maintain traditional stick fighting, while some Lakota families still teach war club techniques orally. In 2012, Navajo martial artist Rickson Gracie, himself of mixed Brazilian and Native heritage, famously incorporated indigenous grappling concepts into his jiu-jitsu, a symbolic homecoming for American warrior arts. Even the most obscure traditions find new expressions. Kalaripayata masters now choreograph Bollywood fight scenes. Indonesian pencak silat, once a village self-defense art, has become a global phenomenon thanks to action films like The Raid. Historical European martial arts, Hema, reconstructed from medieval manuscripts, flourish in tournaments from Berlin to Buenos Aires. What unites these modern evolutions is their relationship to the past. Contemporary practitioners may not sacrifice goats like ancient Greeks or meditate before battle like Shaolin monks, but they're still answering the same fundamental human needs: self-mastery, community, and transcendence through physical discipline. The 21st century has democratized martial arts in unprecedented ways. YouTube tutorials make once secret techniques freely available. Women, often excluded from traditional training, now dominate in MMA and Olympic judo. The UFC's global pay-per-view audiences dwarf the crowds at ancient Olympia. Yet something essential remains unchanged: the understanding that combat arts aren't ultimately about fighting others, but about confronting ourselves. Perhaps that's why these ancient systems still resonate. In an age of keyboards and virtual realities, they offer tangible connection to our physicality and history. When a teenager in Tokyo practices kendo katas, they're moving in unison with 17th century samurai. When a Marine learns Kali knife drills, they're linked to Filipino warriors who resisted colonization. The techniques adapt, but the core truth endures: martial arts are humanity's oldest method of turning violence into wisdom. From the first time a prehistoric hunter showed his son how to grip a spear, to the latest MMA champion studying footage on an iPad, the thread remains unbroken. We no longer fight for survival or divine favor, but we still train, because these arts answer something timeless in the human spirit. They remind us that discipline can transform aggression into artistry, that tradition can coexist with innovation, and that even in our fractured modern world, we still long to touch something ancient and true.